with you. Okay, are you all able to see my screen? I'll open up the chat room in case you want to send me a message. All right. If you want to follow this study on light chess, you can join the study that we have been using so far. I sent you all invitations to it. Here is the link in the chat room, and if someone hasn't received the invitation to this study, just let me know and I'll send you a new one. All right, I see that some of you joined the study. We'll take a look at a game played between Balashov as white and Larsen as black. We'll start from this position. What do you guys think about the position that we have on the board? Who is better here? Is the position even and why? Any ideas? Oh, okay, bishop c5, the king moves. Let's give it a try. So, this move is quite logical, activating the bishop. If the king moves, we can definitely play queen c6. And black did get some activity here. White will probably have to move the king away from this diagonal. These moves are fine for black. Black managed to activate his pieces. But instead of retreating the king, it's more accurate for white to trade these bishops. Let me explain why. Black's bishop is quite active here, and white's bishop is currently not doing that much. So it makes sense to offer a trade. How would you respond to this move? Let's take a look at d4. How many times is white attacking this pawn, and how many times are you defending it? Twice for black and three times for white. So white will simply win material here. Black loses a pawn. Better for black is to simply take. The position is relatively even at the moment, but these two pawns still look a bit scary for black. Let's go back to our starting position. Instead of playing bishop c5, there is a move that's more accurate. First, we need to start by evaluating the position we have on the board. If we take a look at the material, it is even. At the moment, white's pieces seem to be a bit more active, and also these two pawns might become dangerous for black if he's not careful. The best move is to play queen c4. Why this move? What do you think? What will white respond? Taking is probably the only move. Both the queen and the pawn on a2 are under attack. So if the queen moves anywhere that doesn't protect the pawn, we can simply win material. And if the queen goes to c2 in order to protect the pawn, what is the best move for black? d4. Excellent, Nicholas. This pawn is pinned, and now black is the one who has more active pieces. He might be able to push or even take on c3, depending on what white plays here. He definitely has well placed pieces right now. If the queen goes to b1 instead, again we can push d4. This move allows black to activate his pieces. Now white can take, rook takes, and we can say that black managed to improve his position. So the only move for white is to capture the queen, the only good move, and pawn takes. With this trade, Black achieved an open file for his rook. Now he can use that open file to threaten White's pawns. Also, he can include the bishop later on. His position already looks much better because this rook is now active. The bishop is under attack on d2. What is the most logical way to defend that bishop? A rook e2 was played in the game, but this is not the best move. You are tying down your rook to defending this piece. It is more flexible to simply move the bishop. Now your rook is free to move anywhere you want. After rook e2, your rook is not flexible at all. It cannot move because the bishop will be hanging. Which move do you suggest here for Black? There are two good possibilities, or actually three good possibilities. What are your ideas? Any suggestions? Okay, so let's discuss the possibilities. The move bishop c5 definitely makes sense, improving the position of this bishop. Someone has suggested this move previously. Bishop c5, the king will have to move, and Black's position is slightly better. Another choice is b5. This move was actually played in the game, protecting c4 and preparing possibly to push on the queen side. In that way, Black will get a passed pawn on that side of the board. Instead of that, Black could have played rook d3, putting pressure on White's pawns. Black has this open file, and he has this entry square that's available to him. So why not use it? In the game, d5 was played. Bishop e3, simply improving the position of the bishop. And now Black continued with the move we suggested previously. Let's see what happens. If white takes on a7, how should black continue? What do you think? Take on c3. Excellent. Why is it better to take on c3 and not on h3? Taking on c3 is more accurate because black gets a passed pawn that's quite strong. The c pawn is now very dangerous. If you take on h3 instead, you don't really achieve that much. You get a pawn, but nothing else actually. So rook c3. We have an endgame on the board. For that reason, it's a good idea to include the king. In the endgame, the king becomes an active piece. There are no queens on the board. There are not that many pieces that can cause any problems to the king, and we can feel free to move the king closer to the center in order to help our pieces. What do you suggest next for black? b4, excellent. This move was not played in the game, but it is a good alternative. Simply pushing the pawns forward. We can continue with pushing b3 as well and getting a passed pawn on the queen's side. Now, if for example rook d2, b3 definitely makes sense. And we have a very strong passed pawn. White always needs to worry about this possible trade. We can help our pawn using the bishop as well. So not a comfortable position for white. In the game, instead of b4, black chose rook d3. Also a good move. He wants to push his c3 pawn, his pawn to c3. Also, he doesn't allow white to occupy this open file. That's another idea. Now white retreated the bishop. At this moment, both c3 and b4 make sense. In the game, b4 was played. h4. White needs to do something on the king side. He has a pawn majority there, so he needs to create some threats. If he doesn't manage to do anything on the king side, he'll probably lose the game because black will have some dangerous pawns on the other part of the board. What do you suggest next for black? C3 looks quite logical and it is a good move, but B3 is more accurate. Let's see why. If you play C3, how are you going to support that pawn to push it forward? Okay, let me just play a move for white. Now if rook d5, king e4, what is your idea next? Can you support your pawn and threaten to go forward with it? The problem with pushing c3 is that it's very hard to push this pawn to c2. Ideally, we would like to play this move to get rid of the rook trade and then hopefully promote. But we cannot do that because of the bishop. That's why b3. After the trade, it's much easier to push b2 and b1. We can protect b2 using our bishop, for example. We can also try using our rook. Another thing that's very important is that b3 is further away from white's king. So white's king cannot actually threaten this pawn. It will take him longer to approach the pawn and stop it. Now white tried bishop c1, preventing bishop a3. Let's find the best continuation for black. Black's idea should be to prepare and push the pawn forward. This pawn is quite dangerous and it is the best part of Black's position. How can we support that pawn? Okay, quite a logical idea. Bishop b2, and now if rook c2, white can simply trade. What is your idea next? Is there a way to save the pawn from being captured? Okay, it's an excellent try. The idea is to go to D2 and promote. But White's king will come in time in order to prevent that. And now Black will lose the pawn. So if we go back, Rook c3 followed by Rook c2 doesn't work. Let's find something else. If the rook cannot support the pawn, maybe the bishop can. How can you use your bishop in order to support this pawn? If a rook d1, bishop b2, what was your idea? The problem is that the bishop is protected. White will not move that bishop. If we go back, the best move is bishop b4, with the idea to go to c3 possibly and uh, prepare b2. So White tried to prevent this. What next? What is very important to know about the endgames? Bishop c3, bishop takes, and now let's say e6. How would you continue? Okay, rook takes. Can Black win this game? Now the only move to protect the pawn is to play this. And the problem is that black cannot protect b1. If he moves the rook, he will lose the pawn. So this position is a draw. Black cannot win this. Black chose king f8 in the game. Don't forget your king in the endgames. It's very important to activate the king. g5. What do you think is best here for black? Should black take or h5 is also a good move. In the game, black captured, but h5 was a good alternative as well. White is stronger on the king side, so black decided to take in order to eliminate as many pawns as possible. If there are less pawns, white has less targets on the king side. Okay, what next for black? King e8 is excellent, activating the king. If f6, simply pawn takes, and now we just move the king. This is not dangerous. Okay, let's go back to our line. This is not a problem because black's bishop is protecting the promotion square. So activating the king definitely makes sense. In the game, black chose bishop c5. Why this move? What are some possible plans for black? Bishop d4, excellent. Now white played e6. What next for black? Any ideas for black? Taking, excellent. And now what is the best move? Trading bishops, great. If white takes and rook takes, this is a winning endgame for black. After this, let's say e7 and rook b4. The point is that white will have to stop this pawn which will result in losing the pawn on e7. In the game, White decided to avoid the trade. g6. What next? How can Black try to win this? This move was played in the game. Now White chose Rook f2. How would you continue? Rook d5, excellent. Okay, you want to give a check? Let's say White goes here. Would you play Rook g5 next? Great. After this move, White resigned. Let's see why. If the bishop moves to b2, how can Black win the game? This move actually doesn't win the game. White has a way to get a draw here. Can you find a move that saves White? Excellent. If after Rook a2, Rook f6, taking here is not possible because White wins. Black will have to take over here, after which White has drawing chances. So let's go back. Instead of Rook a2, we need to find something else. Excellent, a rook takes. And now what is the winning plan? Great. Black will also capture this pawn. White doesn't have a way to protect it and he will win the game. Okay, that's why after Rook a5, White resigned the game. Let's go back to the beginning. Notice how Black traded queens in order to get a pawn majority on the queen side. The most common idea when we have a pawn majority on a certain part of the board, it can be also in the center, it doesn't have to be on the flank. A central pawn majority is more important than the one on the flank. So when we have a pawn majority, the most common plan is to advance our pawns in order to create a passed pawn. Before advancing, we need to make sure that our pawns are supported by our pieces. If they are not well supported, then they can easily become targets. So make sure that your pawns are protected. Are there any questions about this game? All right, let's take a look at something else. We'll take a look at this game played between Larsen and Seravan. Both players are excellent. Let's take a look at this opening position. What do you think is the best continuation for white here? The position is quite even. It is still the opening, but we need to find the best plan for white. Opening up the center. Well, this move loses the pawn on d4. Also, it might not be such a good idea to open up the center if your king is still in the center. Your king might be in danger. We need to make sure that our king is safe. Knight f3 is quite logical. We can continue with normal development, of course. There is nothing wrong with that. We just have a very natural development. White is perfectly fine, but this is not the best plan for white. The best move here is to play a3. Now black cannot retreat the bishop because he will lose the pawn on d5. Now both c7 and the queen are hanging. If the bishop instead goes to a5, we have b4. And again, this pawn on d5 is a bit shaky. Also, black allowed white to get more space on the queen side and push his bishop back. So, after a3, black is practically forced to take. White's idea was to get the bishop pair. Black had only one advantage in this position. He had the bishop pair, and this move a3 neutralizes that advantage. This is a relatively open position, so we don't want to allow our opponent to have this bishop pair. Now black castled, and white continued with normal development. Notice that it's not good to take here because we will lose the central pawn. And now black has a threat to take on b2. Our development is not good and the king is still in the center, not safe. So e3. Black now protected his pawn on c7. Both sides continued with a very natural development. White castled and black pushed a5. What is the idea of a5? What do you think? Any ideas? All right. So if we go back, this pawn structure that black has is called the Carlsbad pawn structure. And against this pawn structure, and also in other positions as well, it's quite common to go for a minority attack. White's idea is to possibly push his pawns forward and to create some weaknesses on black's queen side. For example, if he takes on c6, he'll get this, black will get this backward pawn, also this isolated one. A minority attack is basically when we are attacking our opponent's pawn structure with our pawns. We have less pawns than our opponent on that side of the board, so our idea is to push them forward and create some weaknesses in the opponent's pawn structure. With a5, black is trying to trade this pawn so that it doesn't become a potential weakness. If we go back, I was explaining this way of attacking and taking on c6. In that case, a7 becomes isolated as well. So it's better for black to trade this pawn than to let it become isolated and weak. Queen d6, bringing the queen closer to the queen side. What do you suggest next for white? In the game, white chose rook fc1, simply bringing a piece to the queen side. It's clear that white will try to get some initiative there, so he might as well bring his pieces to that part of the board. Bishop g4. Now white played a move which was not really necessary, but it doesn't hurt his position. How should white now continue with his minority attack? The main idea of the minority attack is to create some weaknesses in opponent's pawn structure. So to create weak pawns, isolated backward, it's quite hard to create doubled pawns. Most of the times we'll create either backward or isolated. So what does white need to play in order to achieve that? Let's hear your suggestions. All right. In the game, b5 was played. Notice that if black takes, when we recapture, black gets two weak isolated pawns that we can use as targets. And if black doesn't take, if he waits, we will capture and create a backward pawn, so another weakness. Black traded rooks and played a rook c8, trying to protect his pawn. Notice that black is playing quite passively. It was better to play this move and simply try to get some activity here. If white takes immediately, black can damage white's pawn structure on the king side. But white doesn't have to take immediately. White can take later on. It's impossible for black to protect these pawns. That was a better try for black than this very passive move. Queen a7, threatening the pawn. Let's now find the winning tactical idea. Do you have any ideas? I'll give you a hint. It has to do with the fact that Black's rook is unprotected if the knight moves somewhere or is eliminated. So, what can White do about that? No ideas? How can we remove Black's knight? How can we threaten that knight? Knight e5, excellent. Let's see what happens. Now, if Black takes, we can take back. And if Queen e5, how can White win material right now? Yes, simply take the bishop. And White is a piece up. Black cannot take because the queen will no longer be protecting the rook. So knight e5 doesn't work for Black. And if Black takes here, what is the continuation? Take the knight. The queen cannot take because the rook is hanging. Rook d8. Now White captured. This is the backward pawn that I was telling you about, and it is Black's main weakness. How can White threaten that pawn and capture it? Which move does he need to play? Great. After this move, Black retreated the bishop. Notice that this is not possible because f7 is hanging as well. So Black retreated the bishop, which resulted in him losing the pawn. White now has material advantage. This game lasted for almost 40 moves more, so we'll stop it at this point. From this game, it's very important to remember the ideas related to the minority attack. When we have less pawns on a certain side, we can use these pawns in order to attack our opponent's pawn structure. The idea of our minority attack is to trade pawns in such a way so that we create some weaknesses in our opponent's pawn structure. In this game, White created a backward pawn on c6 and he was able to capture that pawn and later on win the game. Do you guys have any questions about what we mentioned today? Pawn majority or minority attack? Okay, no questions, I guess. In that case, I'll see you next week, same time, and we'll learn some more ideas in the middle game. I'll stop sharing the screen and I'll see you guys next week. Have a good week. Bye.
Bye.